All right. Hello. Um, so, um, Before I start talking about Locke, I should just mention that the first metaphysics exercise is due on Tuesday. It's not up yet though. I'm sorry about that. Um, I'll put it up, I hope Sunday, late Sunday morning probably. All right. Um, okay, so we finished book one. Book one is about why the innate principles view is wrong. So now we're starting on Locke's positive view. And the first thing he wants to talk about, this is it's kind of like the inverse of what he did in book one. So in book one, he considered whether there are innate principles. And one of the ways he showed that there aren't is he said, well, there would have to be innate ideas. And there are no innate ideas, so there can't be innate principles. Or anyway, if there are innate ideas, they're vague things like warm and hunger, hunger or whatever. They're not suitable for principles. So now that he's presenting his own positive view, he's going to have to first explain how we get the ideas that are involved in our knowledge. So that's basically what book two is about. And then he's going to have to explain how we put those ideas together to get knowledge. And that's what book four is about. And as he actually says, I forget whether this is the end of book two where he says this or the beginning of book three or anyway, somewhere like that. He says that when he first worked on this, he thought that he would go straight from ideas to knowledge. So there would have only been three books, but he realized that everything about this subject was so connected to language that he had to put another book in about words before he could get to the knowledge book. So that's the plan of what we're looking for. So this first reading is the uh, um, fundamental reading about where ideas come from, according to Locke. Now, first of all, I read this last time, but I want to read it again now that we've actually got to what it's about. This is at the very end of book one, chapter one, or the introduction. Before I proceed on to what I have thought on this subject, I must here in the entrance beg pardon of my reader for the frequent use of the word idea, which he will for the frequent use of the word idea, which he will find in the following treatise. Reading Locke out loud is hard for the same reason it's hard to read it to yourself. You think you got to the end, and all of a sudden you realize there's another part coming. Right. I must here in the entrance beg pardon of my reader for the frequent use of the word idea, which he will find in the following treatise, it being that term which, I think, serves best to stand for whatever is the object of the understanding when a man thinks. I did it again. It being that term which I think serves best to stand for whatsoever is in the object of the understanding when a man thinks, I have used it to express whatever is meant by phantasm, notion, species, or whatever it is which the mind can be employed about in thinking. I could not avoid frequently using it. Right, so the definition of idea is whatsoever is the object of the understanding when a man thinks. Um, the use of the word understanding may be important there. It's um, not clear whether Locke thinks that every mental operation has an object, and that if so, its object is some idea. Um, I mean, I'll maybe talk about that a little bit more when we actually get to other operations. But if he is emphasizing that, then I think understanding here means the faculty of just sort of contemplating something. So it's like the first stage of forming judgment or knowledge or uh, um, any kind of belief, whether rational or not. The first stage is you have to think about the things that your belief is going to be about, right? So that's the understanding, and at least in a narrow sense, that's the understanding. And the object of the understanding when it does that is an idea. Okay, so what does this mean? So here's a general picture of how the mind works according to Locke and how things work in general. That is, this what I'm about to talk about now is metaphysics. Um, and a lot of this is perfectly traditional. So, um, first of all, things, um, technically speaking, substances, but that will actually be important in understanding what Locke says later, but right now it's not so important. But there's things, subjects of actions and passions. So these things have certain powers. So, like for example, here's the mind, and the mind has certain powers or faculties. Not this again. All right, this is power. Sometimes Locke will call them faculties. He actually says that he thinks power is a better word for it. Um, these are pretty much interchangeable. There's a few people who use them for different things, but most people pretty much use these interchangeably. Um, there, you could also say another word for this would be capacity. These are all translations of the same Greek word, dunamis, right? As in dynamic, power. So the mind has certain powers or faculties. Um, and similarly, other things also have powers or faculties. So, for example, here's fire. And one of its powers is the power to heat. In fact, let me be even more specific, the power to heat water, right? Fire has the power to heat water. Now, I mean, when the fire is by itself and there's no water around, it still has that power. It's potentially, right? That's that again, potential or potentiality would be another translation of dunamis. Potentia is how it's translated mostly in Latin. So, um, so the fire is potentially heating water, but it's not actually heating water. And similarly, like here's some water, and one of the powers that water has is the power to be heated by fire. So we can see here that power and um, Locke emphasizes in various places that he's using power in this broad sense, that a power can be either active or passive, right? Some powers are powers to do something, but other powers are powers to have something done to you. Um, if power doesn't sound exactly right in that, like the power to have something done to you, that's why people might prefer to translate as potentiality or capacity, right? But anyway, this way of using power and its equivalents in other languages goes straight back to Aristotle. Um, so there are active powers and passive powers. And again, if the water is sitting over here and there's no fire around, then it still has the power to be heated by fire. It's potentially heated by fire, but it's not actually heated by fire. So, in addition to powers or faculties, things also have um, what traditionally are called acts. And this is not act. It's actually it's um, it's not act as in doing something. It's act as in actual, right? So I mean, there were actually two completely different Greek words that were translated as actus in Latin. This is the one that's behind our word actual, right? So in addition to potentialities, there are actualities, right? Or in addition to potencies or powers, there are acts. And Aristotelians will say the power passes into act. The potency passes into act. So let's say we bring this fire and water together. Now, all of a sudden, there isn't just a, a power to heat water in this fire. There's the act of heating water, right? So this is an act. And similarly, here, and again, this is where you can see that act doesn't mean doing something, and it's not the same act that's inactive, right? Because this act is passive. It's the act of a passive faculty, right? It's the act of being heated. The fire is actually heating and the water is actually being heated. So that's the traditional terminology, and Locke uses it sometimes, but usually, and I think for your purposes, this is an advantage. um, Usually, I think partly because he's worried about that act isn't the right word for this in English. Instead of calling these acts, he calls them operations. Right? So this is the operation of being heated. And saying the power passes into act, he'll say the power operates. There's an operation of the power. Um, I want to pause and ask for questions, but there's very few people here. But if that's not clear, I mean, this is going to be really important, actually. I mean, it's really important in the entire history of metaphysics, but it's going to be really important to understanding Locke and Berkeley and Hume, actually. Okay, so that's like the general metaphysical framework here. And the mind also has powers or faculties, and it has operations of those powers or faculties. Okay, so now I'm going to erase the fire and the water. I'm going to try to erase them. We need a new whiteboard and a new everything. I'm going to erase the fire and the water, and I'm going to draw another thing or substance down here, and this is a snowball. Snowball is Locke's own example. So suppose I see a snowball. What happens according to Locke? Well, first of all, the snowball has two active powers. Um, and these powers, so it has the power to look white. It has the power to feel cold. And Locke calls this kind of power um, a sensible power, that is a power of looking some way or feeling some way. He calls it a quality, right? So the snowball has two qualities. For sure, we could call them the quality of whiteness and the quality of cold, but it's actually important. It's going to turn out that it's not clear what in this picture should be called whiteness or cold. So that's why I want to keep careful track of it and call it the power to look white and the power to feel cold. So these are active powers, active faculties, according to Locke. They're the power to do something to something else. To what? Well, to me, right? So suppose I'm looking at the snowball. So my mind has a power or faculty. It has a lot of them, and one of them is sensation. It has the power of sensation or faculty of sensation. Um, and the faculty of sensation is a passive power. It's a passive faculty. It's the potentiality, the capacity to have something do something to me in a certain way. Oh, there's a question in the chat from Parker. So the actual of something happening is the same as its operation. Right. The act or actuality is the same as operation, as Locke is using the term. Operation is also a traditional term. I think some people use it to mean something a little bit different than act, but Locke is using it as a synonym of the traditional term act, as in actuality. So the answer to the question is yes. All right. Um, right. And sensation. So sensation is a power of my mind. Now, at this point, I have to stop and raise the issue. So, what is my mind according to Locke? Is it different from my body? Is it the same as my body? So, in other words, is this power of sensation the power of a body, like these powers are? Because a snowball is a body. Or is it a power of a spirit, as Locke would say? That is a substance, a thing that's not corporeal, that's not, doesn't take up space and exclude other bodies from its space. So, so Locke says in the introduction that he's not gonna um, have anything to say about that question in this book, or not much anyway. Every once in a while he kind of forgets himself and says something about it. Is he really forgetting himself? Not really, right? This is going to come up more in Hume, but of course, if you accidentally write something that you didn't mean to write, you erase it, right? You don't leave it in and send it to the publisher and whatever, right? So, I mean, when an author says, you know, but I forget myself, I shouldn't be getting into natural philosophy, they mean I'm not, they're creating a fiction that they forgot what they're doing, but they obviously have some purpose in putting it in there. Anyway, but for the most part, he does keep his promise in this, and the book doesn't say anything much about the relationship between the mind and the body. And he says, because it doesn't matter for anything I'm talking about in this book. Right? He says, it doesn't matter whether this power is the power of a body or not. It doesn't matter whether my mind is identical with my body or some part of my body, like my brain, or not. All I have to know is that something has this power that it calls sensation. I think Locke leans towards believing that the mind and the body are different things, but I think he also doesn't think there's a, unlike Descartes in 100b and Descartes' followers, um, Locke doesn't think that there's any, number one, doesn't think that there's any strong proof that those are two separate things, doesn't think it's inconceivable that they're the same thing, and also thinks that it has no relevance to questions about morality or immortality, whether the mind is a body or not. So we'll see a little bit about that later. Okay, so anyway, this is a power of my mind. Whether that means it's a power of my brain or not is not important. What power is it? Well, um, so he describes what sensation is. Book 2, Chapter 1, Section 3, on the top of page 110. Maybe I should start on the previous page. First, our senses, conversant about particular sensible objects, do convey into the mind several distinct perceptions of things, according to those various ways wherein those objects do affect them. And thus we come by those ideas we have of yellow, white, heat, cold, soft, hard, bitter, sweet, and all those which we call sensible qualities, which when I say the senses convey into the mind, I mean they from external objects convey into the mind what produces there those perceptions. Um, so it might not be entirely clear from that passage, and it might not be entirely clear from anything, right? So, like at this point, I'm starting to give my interpretation of Locke, which other people may disagree with, but I think this is what he means. Um, an operation of this power is a perception of an idea. And an operation of this power is what causes me to have the sensation whose object is a certain idea. And in this case, the idea is white. Right? So that was why I didn't want to just call this sensible quality whiteness. Locke already in that passage I read, and later he's going to warn that he does that often, and unfortunately he does, um, doesn't keep completely sorted out what we're calling the quality, what we're calling the idea, right? I mean, when he introduces the terminology, and it's going to be in the reading for next time, when he introduces the terminology carefully, he says this is a quality and this is an idea and they're nothing like each other. But then he also says, but I will often or sometimes use one for the other. All right. So I'm trying to keep to the strict sense of the terminology here. The operation of this power. So this what is this operation? It's the operation of looking white to someone. Since I'm looking at the snowball, it's the operation of looking white to me. What does that mean? What does looking white to someone mean? It means it causes them to have an operation of the faculty of sensation whose object is the idea white. So this idea is the object of this operation. You could also say it's the object of my faculty of sensation. right? My faculty of sensation is operating or has become actualized in this sensation, this mental operation of sensation. And as such, its object is this idea white. You can also say this um, idea white is the object of my mind in sensing. Right, my mind has the power to sense things, and its power is now operating, and it's what it's operating at, so to speak. What's operating about is the idea white. Right, so that again, going back to that passage at the end of the introduction, an idea is whatsoever is the object of the understanding when a man thinks. This is an example of that. When a man or a human being thinks, um, they so um, as I'll explain in a moment, um, Locke, like Descartes, will classify sensation as a kind of thinking. Um, so when I think this particular kind of thinking, which consists in seeing that something looks white, what the object of my mind is the idea white. Um, And similarly, if I feel that the snowball is cold, the same thing's going to happen here. There'll be an operation of feeling cold. It will cause, right? So these dotted lines are causation. It will cause me to have an operation of the faculty of sense whose object is the idea cold. So another um, a stricter definition of idea, and Locke says this sometimes too, is that idea is the immediate object of a mental operation of understanding or thinking. All right, so I want to explain actually both of those words, immediate and object. The first, object. So I've been using the word object a lot. Um, um, and I have to talk about this in essentially every course. So again, people who were in 100B have already heard this. I don't think I already said that in this course, although maybe I did. Um, that object. So now we use the word object mostly as a kind of synonym of like thing or being, right? So you say, oh, what's that object you have there? How many objects are on this table? Um, but originally, um, the Latin word objectum and its Greek antecedent, which is antikemenon, meant didn't we're not synonyms for thing or being. Um, it's the use of object that we have that captures this is more like when you say, what's the object of this plan? Um, Now, a plan is like a practical, as opposed to a theoretical mental state, right? So the object of a plan is like what the plan is about is like what you're trying to get using the plan. right? It's like the object of desire is another expression like that we use. What's the object of your desire means what is your desire about? What that is, what does it aim at? Okay, but here we're using object in the case of theoretical acts, not practical acts. But it's still that same thing. It's like, what does the act aim at? What is it about? So object in this sense, it's always the object of something, right? I can't just say this is an object. I always have to say it's an object of. It's the object of this mental operation. So the object of the mental operation of seeing white, sensing white, is the idea white. At least that's its immediate object. So immediate means that nothing mediates between something and something else. Um, Again, like the way we use the word today can be uh, misleading. It's derived from this, obviously, but we usually use it to mean like there shouldn't be any time between now and when you do this, or there won't be any time between now and when this happens, right? So do it immediately means do it without there being something else that mediates, that comes in between now and when you do it. Um, but uh, but traditionally, immediate is used much more broadly than that. Anytime you're talking about something where there isn't something else in between, that's immediate. Now, isn't what in between? Well, it depends what you're talking about, right? I mean, uh, if you're talking about um, books on a shelf, and I say, what's to the immediate right of this book? I mean, what book is to the right of this book? And there's no other books in between, right? So immediate in that case means no mediating books, no books in the middle. It doesn't mean there's nothing in between, right? Like there's air in between. You wouldn't say, oh no, it wasn't immediately to the right. There was air in between. It means there's no books in between. So immediate object means there's no objects in between. This idea is the object of this operation, not by way of some other object that mediates between them, but immediately. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because according to Locke, there's also another object. This is sometimes called the double object theory. There's another object. Um, the simplest thing to call it would be the mediate object, right? The object that's not immediate. Locke doesn't usually call it that. He usually calls it the external object if we're talking about a body. Um, uh, so, but mediate object is better because it's more general and we're not always talking about a body. Or anyway, not always talking about something we know is a body. So let me say, in this case, the mediate object, what is it? Well, um, again, just as when I talked about the subject of this operation, um, and asked, what is it that has this idea as its object? There were different ways of saying it. I could say it's the operation of sensation. I could say it's the faculty of sensation. I could say it's the mind. So similarly here, when we ask what the external object is, so the simplest thing to say is the external object is the snowball. The idea of white then mediates between my mental operation of sensation and its external object, namely the snowball. Right? So this line here, these lines, like I said, are causation. right? This operation causes me to have this mental operation. These lines here are reference. Again, Locke doesn't usually use that word, but that's what they are. Right? Like aboutness. This operation is about this idea, and this idea is about its cause. And so, by the mediation of the idea, my operation is about the cause of the idea. So, in one sense, in a in a strict sense, as Descartes at least would say, um, I guess Locke kind of agrees with that. In a strict sense, if you ask, what do I see? The answer is, I see the idea white. I see this, and I've drawn these things kind of hanging off the mind, but these are all mental entities, right? That's why this is called the external object. This one's internal. What I see is an idea in my own mind, the idea white. But in a perhaps looser sense, what I see is a snowball. Or, and this is where I said you can describe the object different ways. You could say, I see the whiteness of the snowball, right? Because like that's the aspect of the snowball that I'm actually seeing. Like, I mean, there's other ones too, like its shape, but here we're just talking about the color, right? So what I see is the whiteness of the snowball. The whiteness of the snowball is this power it has of looking white. Um, like the power of fire to heat water, um, this power is not going to have an effect if conditions aren't right, right? It's not going to operate if conditions aren't right. If I'm not here, if the lights aren't on, if the lights are on but they're red lights, right, then this power is not going to have its operation or not going to have its normal operation anyway. But if conditions are right, it will have its normal operation, and its operation is to cause my operation of sensation with this object white. And then this object white will refer me on to the quality that was its cause. And if you wanted to be even more precise, you could say, what I see is the snowball's operation of looking white. So when it comes to, the reason I'm going into all this is because when it comes to bodies, Locke is going to usually use the simple first one I said, right? What I see is the snowball. I see that it's white, something like that, right? Um, but when it comes to the mind, he's going to say something else. Okay, so is this description of the double object theory fairly clear? I mean, maybe it's not clear why someone would say this, right? It seems perhaps needlessly complicated. Um, I think when we get to Berkeley, because Berkeley denies that there's an external object. Yes, Carl.
It seems like this theory really separates all the qualities, but it seems like sensation, they kind of come all together and uh, like you can't really see a color without a texture. And I'm curious how Locke accounts for that or thinks about that.
That's um, really important, but we're going to get to it later. Okay.
Sounds good.
Um, so um, Right. What was I saying? The double object. Oh, yeah. So when we get to Berkeley, so Berkeley is a radical idealist. Idealist means he thinks there are ideas, not things. So on the one hand, we'll see Berkeley agrees this theory is overcomplicated. Why you need all this stuff out here? Just say it's that. Um, but at the same time, when we get to Berkeley, we'll see part of what motivates Locke to accept this picture and Descartes, really, because they don't want to say that. They want to say there is a snowball outside of us. um, um, Okay, so that's sensation. Now, uh, before I introduce reflection, which is the other sort of important first operation of the mind, I'll just say that the mind has lots of powers, obviously, right? I mean, there's lots of things I can do besides see or feel. Locke is going to talk about a lot of them. Um, However, he divides them into two main groups. Um, the two main groups are thought and volition. This basically, right? So volition means will. Some powers of the mind are the powers to will things. Other powers of the mind are the power to think things. So this corresponds basically to that distinction I introduced on the first lecture between theory and practice, or as Locke will say, between speculation and practice, right? These are the speculative powers or faculties of the mind, and these are the practical powers of the mind. And that explains why, from Locke's point of view, sensation is an example of thought, right? Sensation is a theoretical power of the mind. It's the power, according to Locke, it's the first and most fundamental power of knowing something or of having the building blocks of knowing something, right? Because again, what I can know is a proposition, and a proposition is going to involve affirming or denying this idea of some other idea. So first I have to have this idea. So the foundation of all the speculative faculties are whatever the first operations on ideas turn out to be. And sensation is the well, in some sense, sensation is the absolutely first one. I'll say why in a second. But okay, so sensation is a fundamental form of thought or fundamental theoretical faculty, according to Locke. Um, the other one, um, the other fundamental um, faculty, theoretical faculty, is what Locke calls reflection. Kind of running out of room here, but I'm going to try to keep drawing here. Okay. Right? So this is a different power of the mind. It's also a passive power. It's a power to be affected by something. Um, and it's kind of like a sensation, but it's kind of like a sensation of our own mind. Right? So this is what Locke says about it. This is book 2, chapter 1, section 4, again on page 110. This source of ideas every man has wholly in himself, And though it be not sense as having nothing to do with external objects, yet it is very like it, and might properly be enough be called internal sense. Um, so this is another point where um, I know for a fact that some people will disagree with my understanding of Locke, but again, I think this is right. Um, the faculty of reflection works just like the faculty of sensation. What does that mean? Well, so in this case, the what causes so here's the operation of reflection, right? These kind of long thin things are the operations, and the kind of big fat things are the powers. So here's an operation of reflection. So again, it's caused by the operation of something else. Operation of what? Well, of our own mind. So for example, this operation here of seeing white can cause this operation of reflection. So mental operations in general actually do two things at once, or can be doing two things at once if we're paying attention, right? Like the primary thing that this operation does is to see white. But it also, again, if we're paying attention, causes this operation of reflection. And the immediate object of the operation of reflection is an idea. And in this case, it's the idea of sensation. Now, somehow white is also involved here, right? Because I know in this reflection, I know that I'm seeing white, or I sense, so to speak, by my internal sense that I'm seeing white. Uh, but how whiteness comes in is hard to understand. So I'm gonna hopefully talk about that later if I can get it. Not later when we get to other topics that make it clearer. Um, but leaving that aside for a moment, here we have the idea of sensation, right? So this is, Locke will say, one of the ideas that we get by reflection. That's the immediate object. Maybe these should be solid lines for reference. And then the mediate object is, and again, you could say the mediate object is my mind, right? That is, by reflection, I sense, so to speak, I inner sense, I internally sense my mind. And I think that's true according to Locke. He doesn't usually say that though, because that's kind of boring, right? Like that, my mind is the um, internal mediate object of all operations of reflection, right? They're all, so to speak, internal sensations of my mind. Um, Again, you could say it's what the immediate object here, right? And here you can see, like, it wouldn't be right to call it an external object because it's not external. It's the same mind we're talking about here, right? But mediate object, although Locke doesn't say that, is, I don't think he ever says that, is better. So the mediate object, you could say, is the faculty of sensation. And that's better, right? Like at least not every operation of the faculty of reflection has as its object is caused by an operation of the power of sensation. For example, how are we talking about reflection here? Well, because there can be an operation of reflection who which is caused by this other operation of reflection. And its immediate object is the idea of reflection. That's entirely illegible, but but hopefully you follow what I'm saying, right? So we get the idea of reflection by reflecting on reflections. Reflecting on reflections, but and this whereas we get the idea of sensation by reflecting on sensations. But that's a little bit of a misleading way of putting it, reflecting on, because that makes it sound like it's active. But it's not, according to Locke. It's a form, it's just like external sense. It could be called internal sense because it's passive, right? In this situation, my mind acts on itself. It has an active faculty, and its active faculty um, causes an operation of its passive faculty of reflection. I mean, I guess I was running into this. According to this, all passive mental faculties are also like secondarily active, right? Like again, this is the power to to so this is the power to be caused to see white or to be caused to sense. It's a passive faculty. But when it operates, it also can cause something in the faculty of reflection. So in that secondary sense, it's active. Um, right. And this, so at this point, we're finally able to understand what Locke says is the source of all our knowledge. If it's not innate principles, what is it? Um, so this is book two, chapter one, section two on page 109. Let us suppose the mind to be, as we say, white paper, void of all characters, without any ideas. How comes it to be furnished? Whence comes it by that vast store which the busy and boundless fancy of man has painted on it, with an almost endless variety? Whence has it all the materials of reason and knowledge? To this I answer in one word, from experience. Right? So that's the empiricism, as promised. Locke's answer to the question, where does all our knowledge come from? Well, at least all its materials come from experience. So that's the sense in which Locke is an empiricist. I mean, we're going to see that somewhat limits the extent to which he's an empiricist. All the materials of our knowledge come to us through experience.
I have a question.
Yes.
Um, where he says the boundless fancy of man has painted on it, what do you think he's getting at there? Like, what role do humans play in being caused to
Well,
have ideas? Or
so I mean, once we get these ideas, we can do other stuff with them. Um, that's what the boundless fancy of man does.
okay, I see.
But to say precisely, we have to get on to the classification of ideas, which is the next thing I'm going to talk about when I finish this, to say precisely what that distinction is, like what we can't do and what we can. But so far we're saying we get all the materials from experience. Um, and what is experience? Next sentence, our observation employed either about external sensible objects or about the internal operations of our minds, perceived and reflected on by ourselves. Well, our observation employed either about external sensible objects or about the internal operations of our minds, perceived and reflected on by ourselves, is that which supplies our understandings with all the materials of thinking. Right? So those are the two things. There's a sensation and reflection. Um, um, Sensation has as its mediate objects external, what does he say? External sensible objects. Whereas reflection has as its mediate object the operations of our mind. And again, as I say, there's an asymmetry there, right? In this case, he mostly says the object is the snowball. But in this case, he'll mostly say the object is the operation of sensing white. Um, but it's really just different degrees of, like, so to speak, broadness or narrowness in talking about what the object is. Um, okay, and so the fact that these are passive powers, again, at least in their primary sense, right? That is, they have this kind of side activity, right? But the fact that these are passive powers, what does that mean? Well, I mean, for one thing, it means in general, we're forced to have these operations, right? They don't depend on us in the sense, at least, that they don't depend on our will. Um, Now that's kind of a um, strong sense of activity, that to be active, something has to depend on your will. And like in Leibniz and Kant, there's a different sense of activity, um, but which is more abstract and weaker. But uh, I don't think Locke needs that distinction. So yeah, they don't depend on our will. That is, so this is book one, book two, chapter one, section 25 on page 121. My book is falling apart. Hopefully I can find page 121. It's 123. Yeah, 121. All right. Right. So this is actually the very end of chapter one of book two. The mind is forced to receive impressions and cannot avoid the perception of those ideas that are annexed to them. Right? So it's forced to receive impressions. That is, it's forced to operate by the cause of its passive operation. That's the first thing he says, and says, and cannot avoid the perception of those ideas that are annexed to them. Right? So since it can't avoid having this operation, it can't avoid perceiving its objects. That is the idea that's annexed to it. Um, so like that's part of what is entailed by calling it passive. Um, but uh, but I mean that so far that only means that it's sometimes passive, right? Like sometimes we're forced to. But Locke also thinks that the faculty of sensation is always passive, that we can't this faculty never can operate except when it's forced to. We can't make it operate. And you need both of those to really be an empiricist, or you need the second one, the second stronger one to really be an empiricist, right? This means that we can only get this idea if the external object makes us have it. We can't just come up with it on our own. So all the materials for for thought and therefore for knowledge come to us by being forced, by being affected by something. And as I said, even though these are kind of co-equal parts of what Locke calls experience, this one has to initially come first, right? Because um, before something moves this one into operation, there's nothing to reflect on. So the first thing that happens, like when the baby is born or in the womb, perhaps, um, is that something calls this faculty of sensation into operation. Something forces it into operation. And then later, and Locke says this doesn't happen so much in the early parts of life where we're so busy acquiring ideas through our senses. But later on, at least more thoughtful or reflective people start to pay more attention and they start to have more of these operations of reflection on their own mind. Um, but, uh, no matter how early this comes, it has to come after this starts. Okay, so that's what experience and sensation and reflection are. Um, are there any questions about that before I go on? Because the next and the only other thing I'm going to talk about is the classification of ideas.
I have a question.
Sure.
What, um, what does the faculty of reflection do? Just does it like abstract or something, or?
No, it's just like sensation. Right, so
Hmm.
this is a simple, well, I'm just about to introduce the terminology of simple idea, but this idea is it's a kind of sensation. It's like white. I mean, it's a kind of internal sensation, right? Like if you were to call this internal sense, as Locke says, you could properly call it internal sense. So you could call these both sensation, external sensation and internal sensation. This idea of sensation would be analogous to this idea of white. It's a kind of um, object that we immediately perceive when we're affected by our own active sensation. Um, so it's not like more abstract or anything like that. I'm about to talk about
Hmm.
both simple versus complex and particular versus abstract. So
Okay, yeah,
um,
thank you.
then I'll be able to say this better. Um, uh, and it's also notice that this is not the way we perceive ideas, right? The immediate object here is this operation, not the idea. How do we perceive the idea? Well, this operation perceives the idea, right? It's its immediate object. That's how we know ideas. We don't need a sideways way to know ideas because that's what we know, right? But this operation doesn't perceive itself. For that, we need another operation of reflection. And that operation of reflection, just like this one, has to be mediated by an idea. So, like what we know immediately is ideas. The way we know both about external things and the operations of our own mind is immediately by means of ideas. Did that, I think that was more than the answer to your question, but it seemed like it was called for by your question. All right. Um, okay. So I think I can erase all, well, I think I may erase all of this now. That distinction. I don't know if I can. Something's wrong with these board. They're not erasing. And something's wrong with my tripod here, so the floor keeps threatening to fall over. That's gonna have to do, even though there's still a bunch of books and stuff. Um, okay, so there's two main ways that Locke classifies ideas. Well, now you can see more of what's behind it. There used to be a lot of plastic horses back there and pet rocks, but they're mostly gone now. Still a few pet rocks. This one's name is Rat. All right. The pet rots and plastic horses have mostly been eliminated, but all right, sorry. Back to Locke. So um, there's two main ways that Locke classifies ideas. One is simple versus complex, and the other is abstract. Sometimes he also calls these general versus particular. This is um, this is a straightforward opposition. Simple and complex are opposites of each other. This is kind of weird. The opposite of abstract should really be concrete. The opposite of particular should really be universal. The opposite of general should really be special. um, but this is the contrast that Locke usually uses: abstract versus particular. Okay, so the first one, simple versus complex, is the one that's easier to understand. The um, abstract versus particular is I'm going to introduce it now, but I'm going to also hopefully get to saying this why it's hard to understand, and I'll only finish explaining how I understand it when we get to the operation of abstraction later. Um, Perhaps next time. I don't remember the slopes. Anyway, later. All right. So simple versus complex. So, like I said, this is fairly straightforward. For example, suppose I'm thinking about a snowball. Um, like, suppose I have an opinion about a snowball, like snowballs are cool or whatever, right? So the snowball is the subject and cool is the predicate. That's a proposition. So the two ideas in the proposition are snowball and cool. Um, so snowball is an idea, right? So here's two examples of ideas. One we've already seen, white, and here's another one, snowball. Now, um, when I think about a snowball, I think about something that, among other things, is white and cold. When I said snowballs are cool, I didn't mean cold. Maybe that was a bad choice of predicate. So if cold is part of the idea of a snowball, then that's what Locke calls a trivial proposition. So um, Maybe I should say snowballs are dangerous or something like that. Anyway, it doesn't matter. I'm not going to talk about that predicate anymore. I'm just going to talk about the idea of snowball. Snowball is an idea. The idea of snowball involves both whiteness and coldness, also spherical shape and other properties too. Um, right? Like cotton ball put in the freezer, even if it's spherical and is cold and white, is not a snowball. So the real idea of snowball has lots of other things in it, but let's just focus on the fact that it includes both cold and white. So it can be broken up into parts. So snowball is an example of a complex idea. And the parts it can be broken up into are themselves ideas. Right? So a complex idea is an idea that's made out of other ideas. Now, some ideas, Locke doesn't talk about this very often, but he does sometimes, and it's clear he thinks this. This is a multi-stage process, right? So, like some ideas are more complex than others, right? Like the idea of a snowball fight, let's say, involves the idea of snowball, among others. Right? So you take this already complex idea of snowball and you combine it with others to get an even more complex idea. Um, and that presumably can, that process of making more and more complex ideas can continue indefinitely, right? I mean, presumably at some point we run out of our human capacity to do that, but there's no fixed limit. Ideas can get as complex as they want. But at least this is what Locke thinks. In the other direction, it can't go on forever. As you break complex ideas up into parts, eventually you have to get to ideas that don't have other ideas as their parts. And those are the simple ideas, right? So a simple idea is just an idea that doesn't have other ideas as parts. It can't be broken up into other ideas. And white, also cold, according to Locke, is an example. Right? So Locke thinks that white is a simple idea. Perhaps each specific shade of white, if there are shades of white, it's a simple idea. I guess there aren't really shades of white. Anyway, um, um, so now, right? So I mean, we're going to get to much more confusing examples of complex ideas later on. Snowball is a one that's relatively easy to understand. Um, it seems like you just kind of you kind of have a list of properties and you put cold and white and some other things on it, and that's your idea of snowball. Um, all right. But with this distinction in place, we can now say more precisely exactly what Locke's empiricism amounts to. What is it that we can't do unless we're affected by an external object? The answer is the mind can't make its own simple ideas, right? So, book two, chapter one, section five on the top of page 111. Um, so he says, like, he imagines asking someone, what are the constituents of all the ideas that they have? Let anyone examine his, and it's great, it's his, not his or her or their. Let anyone examine his own thoughts. But again, he doesn't mean that, right? He doesn't mean this doesn't apply to women. but it's not innocent either. And again, I'll talk about that when it comes up more directly. Let anyone examine his own thoughts and thoroughly search into his understanding, and then let him tell me whether all the original ideas he has there are any other than of the object of his senses or of the operations of his mind considered as objects of his reflection. And how great a mass of knowledge soever he imagines to be lodged there, he will, upon taking a strict view, see that he has not any idea in his mind, but one of these two have imprinted, though perhaps with infinite variety compounded and enlarged by the understanding, as we shall see hereafter. Was that exactly the right thing to read? I feel like not, because it's a place where he says this more straightforwardly. But anyway, as you can tell from the end of what I read, he's talking about simple ideas there, right? So all this, look into your mind, take apart every idea to get to its simple pieces. You'll find all of those simple pieces are ideas either of external objects received through sensation or of the operations of your own mind received through reflection. So in receiving simple ideas, the mind is passive, as he also says. That's the thing I should have quoted, but I didn't put it in quotes or put where it is. But I think that is a quote actually. In receiving simple ideas, the mind is passive, right? And again, like that's the whole content of empiricism as far as Locke goes. The fact that we can't make new simple ideas. Given simple ideas, we can put them together in new ways, right? Like, so for example, if I have the idea of a horse, now that's not a simple idea, but it's composed of simple ideas that came through sensation. Perhaps all together when I saw a horse. Or perhaps not. Perhaps I've never seen a horse, but someone described it to me. But I got each individual idea through some other sensation. But anyway, so like I have that idea of horse that's composed of simple ideas I got from sensation. I have an idea of a horn growing out of an animal's forehead that I got from simple ideas of sensation. I can put them together to form a new idea of unicorn that no one has ever seen or sensed, right? So that's a creation of the mind. It's not passive as far as that goes. It's made something new that isn't, there is no such external object as a unicorn. But when you go the other direction, take your idea of a unicorn apart into its pieces, you'll see that the colors and shapes and whatever that went into it, when you get down to the simple pieces, none of them are things that you made up. You can't make up a new color. You can only get that through sensation. And so those materials of all our thought and knowledge, the simple ideas, because ideas are the material of all our thought and knowledge, because it all consists of propositions, which consist of predicating ideas of each other. And ideas themselves all can be taken apart into simple ideas. And all the simple ideas came through experience. And so all the materials of our objects come ultimately from experience. Okay, so that's the first distinction. Are there questions about that before I go on to the other distinction? I shouldn't erase that. Well, I guess I should erase it. I might need all of them. Abstract versus particular. So an example of this distinction is supposed to be um, the idea. So suppose there's a particular snowball that I'm holding right now and looking at. or that I remember, some particular snowball. Or it could, well, Locke doesn't talk about this very much. It could maybe be a particular snowball that I'm imagining too, a fictional snowball. But let's keep to real snowballs. So it's a snowball that I'm either sensing right now or that I remember. So I have an idea of that snowball, right? So I can think like I can give it a name, I can say, call this snowball Fred. And then I can say, um, Fred weighs, you know, 2 ounces, right? So like that, um, that belief, perhaps it could amount to knowledge or perhaps not, but that opinion is an opinion about Fred, not about snowballs in general, right? And so for there to be a subject, that there has to be idea of Fred, right? So that's an example of a particular idea. The idea of Fred the snowball. Actually, one of the pet rocks here is Fred. All right. Anyway, um, so but on the other hand, I can also think something like this, like the example I gave before. Snowballs are dangerous. So that's not a thought about any particular snowball, right? It's not about Fred, for example, alone, right? Because even if Fred is dangerous, if the other snowballs aren't dangerous, it's false, right? So it's not about Fred in particular. It's about, and like I said, sometimes instead of abstract, Locke calls these ideas general. It's about snowballs in general. And assuming that proposition, like all propositions, is affirming one idea of another. Now, like if you've taken Phil 9 and you think about it, you'll realize that that's not the way we look at propositions like that now. They're more complicated, right? But this is the traditional way of looking at them. If and are we right and they're wrong? I think that's not easy to say, actually. Right. But anyway, so the way Locke thinks about it is, so that proposition has an idea that's its subject and it predicates something of it, dangerousness, right? And so that idea that's the subject of snowballs are dangerous is the idea of a snowball in general. And that's an example of an abstract idea. So, why is it called abstract? I mean, it's clear why it's called general, right? The whole genus, not in the technical sense of species versus genus, but in the like non-technical sense of genus in Latin, like the whole family, the whole tribe of snowballs, um, is the object of this idea. So it's general. But why is it called abstract? So abstract means um, abstract is basically the same word as subtract. Right? It's just like the question is whether you tracked it like off or out from under or something like that, right? Um, and in fact, in like when medieval people talk about arithmetic, they often call subtraction abstraction. Um, right. So, so abstraction is somehow about taking something off something else. Now, so like easy way to understand that. Um, the snowballs are all different from each other. So all their ideas are different from each other, right? So like if, if like Delilah is another snowball, then the idea of Fred and the idea of Delilah are different ideas. They contain different simple ideas in them. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to tell them apart. But on the other hand, all the snowballs have something in common. They're all white, they're all cold, they're all spherical, they're all made of tiny pieces of ice, etc. Right? Um, so within the idea of Fred, here's the idea of Fred. There's some things that are particular to Fred, right? This is the Fred part. And there's some things that are common to all snowballs, common to snowballs in general. I'm writing here. So take your idea of Fred, subtract the part that's, or abstract the part that's particular to Fred, and you have the idea of a snowball in general. Okay, so like I said, that's the easy way to understand it, but now I'm going to raise a puzzle about it. Um, what about an idea like white or cold? A simple idea. So almost everything has been subtracted from it or abstracted from it. Um, so like you might think that simple ideas are the most abstract ideas, and that these two distinctions are not at all independent of each other, right? Rather, the procedure by which you abstract from parts of a complex idea is what leads you back to the simple ideas, and the simple ideas are the most abstract ideas. Um, and yet, here's Locke's own description of seeing a snowball. So this is section 3, book 2, chapter 1, section 3. First, our senses, conversant about particular sensible objects, do convey into the mind several distinct perceptions of things, according to those various ways wherein those objects do affect them. And thus we come by those ideas, I read this part before, thus we come by those ideas we have of yellow, white, heat, cold, soft, hard, bitter, sweet. That is, it seems like what our senses first deliver is simple ideas. And he says this more clearly um, at the beginning of chapter 2. So this is on back on page 121, which I have here. Come off my book. Um, Though the qualities that affect our senses are in the things themselves so united and blended, there is no separation, no distance between them. Yes, 'tis plain the ideas they produce in the mind enter by the senses simple and unmixed. For though sight and touch often take from the same object at the same time different ideas, um, well, actually, I'm not going to read the rest of this, but maybe I should. The so I mean he's dealing with a complication here. He's saying like don't we sometimes get two simple ideas in the same sense, right? Like coldness and hardness both come through touch. He says nevertheless they come in simple. They don't come in mixed with each other. Right? So the coldness and hardness which a man feels in a piece of ice being as distinct ideas in the mind as the smell and whiteness of a lily or as the taste of sugar and smell of a rose, there is nothing that can be plainer to a man than the clear and distinct perception he has of those simple ideas, which being each in itself uncompounded contains nothing but one uniform appearance or conception in the mind and is not distinguishable into different ideas. Right? So the picture is in the snowball, and now I do kind of regret erasing my picture. Here's my mind. In the snowball, there were these two qualities of looking white. Now I'm just going to call them white and cold. But remember that strictly speaking, white and cold should be are names of the ideas that they cause me to perceive, right? So in the snowball, there are two qualities of whiteness and coldness. That is, two powers to cause me to perceive things. But Locke says these powers aren't actually separate from each other in the snowball, right? They're mixed together throughout the snowball. In fact, like it's really the same thing. It's because the snowball is made of tiny pieces of ice. Obviously, it's cold because it's made of tiny pieces of ice, and ice is cold. And it's white because it's made of tiny pieces of ice. Because if you take anything that's made of tiny transparent pieces, like sugar or snow or foam or whatever, it's always white. And I won't explain why, but because of total internal reflection. So like the same fact about the composition of the snowball basically is both its power to look white and its power to feel cold. They can't be taken apart. Nevertheless, even though they're inseparably blended in the snowball, the ideas of them enter the mind simple and unmixed. So if we counted these as abstract ideas because they're simple, as I was suggesting before, we would have to say, where does abstraction happen? It doesn't happen in the mind. It happens between the snowball and the mind, right? By the time they got to the mind, they were simple and unmixed. And so the mind would start off with very abstract ideas and then combine them. And eventually, by making them somehow complex enough, it would get to particular ideas. So, like the idea of a particular snowball like Fred, which is very, very complex, would have to come much later. So, and the main activity of the mind would be not abstraction, but the opposite of abstraction, synthesis. So, but that's not the way Locke talks about abstraction. As you'll see, he says that we start with particular ideas and that infants and non-human animals have only particular ideas and that abstraction is a faculty that only humans have, as far as he knows. I think if you told him, hey, dolphins could also do this, he wouldn't, he's an empiricist. He would say, oh, that's interesting. Dolphins could do it too, right? But as far as he knows, only humans can do it. Um, and it comes much later. And perhaps it requires language as part of learning how to do it. Um, so that's the puzzle. Why does it looks like what we get first are the simplest ideas, and that the abstraction is done by our sense organs, right? That only respond to one aspect of a thing and not to something else. And then what the mind has to do afterwards is put them together. But that's the opposite of what Locke says actually happens. He says we start off with particular ideas, and then we have to learn with great difficulty to abstract. All right, so I'm going to leave you with that puzzle, especially because I'm out of time. And the next class will be on, again, this weird makeup class on Monday, and then we'll be back to the normal class schedule. And so I will see, I hope, even more people then. All right, bye.